Are you guys just too lazy to keep up with the latest seasonal anime? Well, I did that job for you. I watched a shit ton of anime this season, which was absolutely painful for me because this season had a shit ton of shows that caught my interest. So I'll be recommending most of those in this video, from the order of I highly suggest this to sure, watch it if you want. I don't know. So anyway, let's get on with it. 86. As the title suggests twice, is a military anime set in an empire with racial division. I've heard a lot of people compare this to Code Geass, which I haven't watched so I can't say personally. This is a fucking marvelous show. Everything that makes up the show is just done so well and it results in an amazing adaptation. From its music, sound design, animation, CGI, character writing, storytelling, editing, and of course my favorite, the directing. All of this is handled well and made for a spectacular anime. This easily became anime of the season for a lot of people. There are a lot of characters in this story, and despite not all of them being fleshed out as well as others, you can feel this sense of familial bond between all of them, much like the characters from Darling in the Franxx. The action is top-notch with some absolutely hype action sequences. The CGI here is pretty good for a mecha show. A lot of times during my watch, I found myself just bopping along to the action whenever the soundtrack comes up because it is a bop. The sound design as well is just a chef's kiss to the plate. It reminds me of the first episode of Fire Force during that train station scene. The directing and editing complement each other so well. There are scenes where characters are just having fun times, maybe a beach episode, and then suddenly just cut to them fighting for their lives. And when someone dies, it's not really over-dramatized. A lot of times it's abrupt, and they show more of the grieving of our characters and how they get on with their lives as death just becomes a normal thing to them in the battlefield. They also do this thing where half the episode switches perspective to Lena and we get to see her side of things. And we also see the contrast of her life compared to the 86. This was a really neat choice of direction because sometimes it feels like seeing pieces of a puzzle put together. But it's not much of a mystery aspect, it's more of just insight between two characters. And lastly, I think the most surprising thing that even I just had my jaw on the floor when I first heard this was that they only adapted one volume for these 11 episodes. One volume! That's not even the gold standard of light novel adaptation, that is way beyond. And somehow, they were still able to make each episode dense while maintaining a solid pace. I'm just completely taken aback. This is an absolute diamond of a show that everyone should be watching. Well, I certainly took my time with 86. But next on the list, we have Vivy Fluorite Ice Song, an anime original made by the amazing staff at Wit Studio, and together they worked alongside the author of ReZero, Eiji Omehara, to create this beautiful story. I think the best way I can describe this story is that it has a Violet Evergarden type of storytelling with a Terminator plot and a pinch of idols. So it's about an idol robot who's trying to save humanity because apparently AI will have gone berserk by 100 years and it's up to Vivy to prevent that from happening. Vivy Fluorite Ice Song is an enjoyable ride from start to finish and probably the most refreshing show of the season. We get to see her encounter different characters with different stories throughout time. Although it's not episodic because all these different stories lead our main character in her mission, which is to stop the end of the world, and each individual story has its own message towards our main character. But they do also have some emotional payoff at the end of each individual story. Now I do have a little bit of a nitpick, and it has to do with the author's way of writing, I guess you could say that, because the author is amazing at making an interesting world. But in terms of actual world building, he doesn't seem to land that mark. Because this also happened in ReZero where he set up this interesting world, yet he focused on our main character and the story revolves around our main character that it completely just overshadows this world building that they do. It's not really a bad thing, and that's why I just say it's just a little nitpick of mine because the story is still great. And while not all of them seem to hit the mark, the series overall is beautiful in its visuals, storytelling, and most important of all, the music. They really nailed each emotional scene with the music just kicking in at the right moment. Although not a lot of songs for an idol anime, I'm gonna be listening to the soundtrack on repeat whenever it comes out. I don't see a reason why you wouldn't watch Vivy. It's an anime original with only 13 episodes, so it's an easy watch and one that I think many will find special. Shadow's House is a story that I personally can't explain. Of course, I can tell you what happens in the show, but it's probably not something that would catch people's attention. For me, I came into this show blind, only knowing about the poster and the fact that it's done by Cloverworks. Just those two things made me interested enough to watch the show. And I know I make comparisons to other animes a lot, it's just my excuse for my lack of vocabulary, but Shadow's House feels like Promised Neverland in the sense that you follow these kids in this unfamiliar setting and you just want to figure out what's going on. Tone-wise, it's quite different from The Promised Neverland. It's a bit less dark even in the supposedly dark scenes. I wouldn't necessarily call it light-hearted either. While there are a lot of moments like that, the premise or the mystery surrounding this mansion feels a bit sinister if you look at it. It's just that it's a grim and dark setting overshadowed by a bright cast of characters, which I think are the best part of this show. I love all these characters. I didn't realize until sooner, but I found myself smiling at our main protagonist, Emilico, whenever she does anything. I was interested in seeing how each pair would build their relationship, but at the same time, I'm still intrigued by the mystery of the mansion. It's good and it has its wholesome moments, so go watch it. Pretty Boy Detective Club. This show was a treat. The title will not deceive you. This show is definitely beautiful, definitely has boys, and is definitely a detective show. Keep in mind, I came into the show having a decent knowledge behind Shaft and Nishio Ishin, and I wasn't disappointed. To sum up this show, it's basically Hyoka and Oran High School Host Club with a monogatari touch. And if you don't know about any of the animes I just mentioned, well, shit. I love the visuals that I saw. Lots of shiny and glittery colors. The framing of each scene feels very Shaft, or more specifically has that Akiyuki Shinbo feel to it. The writing from Nishio Ishin is very similar to Monogatari with that playful dialogue, both in the actual writing with the many wordplays the author likes to do, and it also has those interactions between characters that have that playful tone that all Nishio Ishin animes I've seen have. This definitely hits both demographics of Monogatari fans and otome genre lovers. Just a little note to those who aren't familiar with the Monogatari series, but there is a lot of dialogue, and since it's a mystery, it still keeps you intrigued, but just keep that in mind when getting into this show. Koitu yobu ni wa kimochi warui, or koitimo, because I failed in that pronunciation. One of the most wholesome and sweetest animes of that season. There's really nothing special about it, it's just cute and wholesome. The chemistry between the characters was just adorable. I honestly have nothing else to say. It's just a simple rom-com that's an enjoyable watch. If you just want a bite-sized rom-com you can just chill with, then definitely check this out. Mars Red is a very unique show in a lot of ways. It's a vampire military type of show, but it's not the usual type of show you'd see when you hear vampires. I didn't think I would fully come to like it until I actually finished the entire 13 episodes. Right off the bat, its art style looks different compared to a lot of shows this season. But aside from the art style, the style of direction as well is distinct from your typical anime. I would say it almost feels like Monogatari, but it doesn't go that far. It walks in a fine line between cinematic and artistic, and the reason for this could be the source it's derived from, which is a stage play. Almost all the scenes in the show feel like you can see this acted out on a stage. Each shot portrays a setting and our characters act out their scene like they're on a spotlight. When it transitions, we don't see our characters going there. It feels as if curtains cover the scene as the staff changes props behind it. And this can put off a lot of people. It almost did for me. I was hooked from the first episode but gradually lost interest towards the middle. But after finishing it, I can say that I really wouldn't have appreciated this as much as if I hadn't finished it. It won't be a show for everyone, but it's a show that deserves to be watched in its entirety. Records of Ragnarok. Oh boy. The whole show is just a tournament arc between gods and famous humans. Records of Ragnarok is an absolute mixed bag for me. I wasn't really expecting much from this anime, as I've said in a previous video. I wasn't expecting any One Punch Man from the trailers I've seen. What I was expecting was that they captured the hype I got while reading the manga. And to some extent they did. Most of the shots look pretty similar to the manga. Visually, they did an amazing job. The character designs were very detailed and they carry that detail into every shot. That is, with a catch. Shots do look pretty detailed, it's just that on the other hand, the animations were quite lacking. I do think that they tried to make it up by having some good directing with each shot. By that, I mean that they still had me hype when the two PNGs started to duke it out. And if it were only that, I would have still given the show some good praise. But then we go to the pacing and it's pretty bad. Flashbacks seem to overstay their welcome and it sometimes takes up most of the episode. Adaptation-wise, they seem to have adapted the books pretty faithfully. I just think that these types of stories become very difficult when you're turning them into animation. Also, a lot of weird directorial choices happen at the most crucial points in the show. One moment it's a hype fist fight, the next moment it's a literal slideshow. Literally. Another one I think was the final moment of the third battle where they just forgot about the sound effects and it was just music playing in the background. Really just some weird choices that happen at important moments. And overall, this show seems to polarize audience with its presentation. But it's an easy watch on Netflix, so I'll recommend it nonetheless. But if you do decide to read the manga, which I do heavily recommend, do read it from the first chapter. It's just a much better experience. Oh boy. 究極進化した Full Dive RPG が現実よりもクスゲだったら Which I'm just gonna call Full Dive RPG because who knows how many words I butchered from that. Really fun time watching this. I think anyone who likes the RPG genre would like this as well. Imagine SAO, but there's no bullshit logic and the entire game just wants to see you suffer. Coming from the same author as Cautious Hero, Full Dive brings out a world that's way too realistic for gaming standards and it makes for some good laughs. This fits in with the trend of fantasy setting with a twist that's been popular in the recent seasons, but this one is actually good. I was enjoying my time in this world that they built. The most notable aspect is how consistent they were with the whole realistic system of the game. And it's not really realistic as in real life, since it is set in a fantasy world. It's more realistic in its mechanics and it stays true to its rules. Of course, it's not flawless. There is one inconsistency and it's also the most distracting one. But how does an individual story quest connect to the MMORPG as a whole? Because our protagonist is in this MMO game, but he also has his own storyline that apparently happens to all players, but for some reason, it kind of centers towards him since he's the new player. It's never really explained, but whatever. I mean, nonetheless, I didn't really let that bother me too much as this was a very fun show. Many times it pokes fun at SAO and I kind of found that funny. I think you would appreciate this more if you watch SAO because it does nod to it a lot of times, whether it's intentional or not. If you haven't watched SAO, this might just feel like another RPG anime with a bit of a twist. It has some decent animation and the voice actors were very charismatic with their roles. Plus, the ED is just stuck in my head, so go watch it. Yukoku no Moriarty. I've only talked about the first season briefly some seasons ago, but this show is a gem. It's not a great or amazing series, but it's surely a good time. It's a retelling of the Sherlock Holmes stories in the perspective of Moriarty. A lot of people are gonna be mad by what I'm about to say, but it's sort of like Death Note. Of course, it doesn't have the nuances or the great writing that Death Note had, but it has that cat and mouse type of premise with our two intelligent main characters, Moriarty and Sherlock. It doesn't pull any complex ideas at you. It's just rich bad, therefore we change the world. But it executes it pretty well in that we get to empathize with the main character who's also the anti-hero of the story, Mr. James Moriarty. The 2 seasons, or I guess the 2 cores to the series, sort of make a well-wrapped story that you can easily binge. I've briefly talked about Super Cub before, and after finishing it, I can safely say that it is still the same comfy show I watched a few months ago. Literally just a bunch of girls who want to ride their Super Cubs. I'll be repeating a lot of things I said on my other video, but Super Cub is just a really relaxing show with precious characters and a very slick promotion from Honda. If you feel like you just want to take a break from all that shonen or melodrama, Super Cub is just that. The entire show uses classical music as their soundtrack, and it just adds more to that cozy feeling. The way they color up the world as our character starts to enjoy life more and more is a nice touch to this wholesome atmosphere. Everything about this is just relaxing, and I don't think I have any problems. Except episode 11, what the fuck was that? You can still enjoy the show, it's just that episode 11 felt like Honda really forced the writers to insert the branding in, and it really put me off. But yeah, if you can just ignore that, the series is definitely a good break if you're fatigued from all that shonen or other shows that you've been watching. Coming from the same author as Konosuba, this show is about this agent duo deployed by an evil corporation to take over planets by slowly infiltrating them. Whatever the case is, I'll be comparing this to Konosuba, and I'm not even sorry. Whichever came first, I personally think Konosuba was better. However, comedy is subjective, so I can't really say the same for you guys. You guys might like this better than Konosuba, who knows? But I would say the one thing that throws me off in the series is the sci-fi plot. I guess Konosuba just works well as an isekai, or maybe I just prefer isekais way more, but the setting of the show didn't really hook me. I think what made Konosuba work for me was because of the oversaturated isekai genre. Because they got to make fun of it, its humor just hit harder in that. Compared to here, it doesn't feel like they're putting anything new to the table. Also, when it comes to comedy anime, I just think animation is a big selling point. When it looks like this, a bit on the lesser side, it kinda demerits the jokes for me. It's still the same crude jokes you get from the author's previous work, even got a good laugh at some parts, and still enjoyed watching it weekly, but I wouldn't really have it as a must-watch. Osamake, the Romcom where the childhood friend never loses. The title says it all. Now, this is an example of a self-aware genre being too oversaturated nowadays that it ends up being mediocre. I will have to come out and say that I'm not a big fan of harems. Didn't like the first season of Quintessential Quintuplets. I thought Nisekoi was okay, and I haven't watched We Never Learn. I don't plan to. And Osamake, for a very self-aware title, its content is pretty generic and tropey. And the funny thing is, it's not even the harem aspect that's what kept me watching this show. There's this subplot in the show that sort of tackles the Japanese television or show business workings, and I found that really interesting. But when it goes back to flirting and girls fighting over this protagonist, it just felt painfully boring. And I just wanted to skip to the good parts, which I didn't, by the way, so more suffering for me. And what's even funnier is that the character I like the most isn't even the girls. You'd think I'd be betting on one of the harem choices as a winning girl, but no, it was actually the protagonist himself. They show a lot of his backstory, and that made me like his character a lot, compared to these girls who are just plain generic. But then again, these are words that are coming from someone who doesn't like harem. The only reason I decided to watch this was because I thought it was going to be a parody like Goreski. It's just another generic harem, and I think it's not really worth your time, unless if you like trashy harem. JORAN Princess Snow of Blood is a supernatural political thriller revenge story. It's a lot of things, and I'll have to be honest, this was pretty hard to finish. I would have dropped this show if I wasn't 6 episodes in already. It's just that every episode I watch, I struggle to get the motivation to watch the next, and each episode feels longer than it is. But when I do watch an episode, there is some entertainment in it. If you look hard enough, you can find a decent revenge story and a good political crime thriller. I think the show just lacks in a lot of things, but has this solid foundation. It just fails to show everything it needed. Everything was just okay at best. The revenge plot was okay, the supernatural plot was okay, and the political plot was okay. Even the characters were just okay. Although visually this show looks pretty eye-catching with its art style that looks like brushstrokes. And also the steampunk setting in this dystopian Tokyo looks pretty cool. Animation was solid as well. It felt very traditional, if that makes sense. But overall, the show was just lackluster. Being their first TV show project of the recently surfaced studio Backend Record, I'm hoping to see more of their project as they do have a very solid animation team with them. But this show was just a miss for me. And that was all of it, I think. I'm still planning to watch a bit more shows, and also the ongoing ones, which I didn't include here because they're also ongoing. But like the second season of Megalobox and the Sayonara Watashi no Kramer, I'm also gonna watch those. I just didn't have time to include them here. But that was all, guys. What do you guys think of the list? And if you guys did try to follow my recommendations, was it worth it? Comment down below your thoughts. And I'll see you in the next video.